In 1780, where we are now was a part of North Carolina. As a matter of fact, North Carolina went all the way to the Mississippi River at that time. And this was Davidson County, North Carolina. It was in the midst of the Revolutionary War, and all of a sudden it appeared to everybody that the colonies were going to win their independence. So the state of North Carolina had started thinking about how they were going to pay their debts. They had had all these soldiers who had been fighting for them without compensation, and they'd had a lot of other people who had been rendering service to the colony of North Carolina. And so they hit upon the idea of giving land grants in compensation for military service as well as other kind of service. And the place that they chose to do that was right here in Middle Tennessee in what is now Brentwood, Tennessee. And it's sort of interesting that the reason they chose to give this land away as land grants is because this was the best that they had. And they skipped over 200 or 300 miles of wilderness to designate this as what they call the military reservation. There were several, as I said, there were several kinds of land grants that were given. The military grant was only one of them, and that, of course, was awarded for military service. Sort of interesting to note that a lot of times that the people who received the grant never saw the land. They sold the grant to people. Maybe they didn't want to come for various reasons to Tennessee, and they would sell the grant to somebody else who would in turn maybe subdivide it among other people who wanted to come and settle on smaller tracts of land. So we see that subdivisions are nothing new to Brentwood, Tennessee. One of the earliest families in Brentwood who received several grants were the Crockett family. There were three brothers, John, Andrew, and James, all of whom received land grants in Brentwood. Their grants were military grants, but they bought them from people who had rendered military service to North Carolina. And the Knox Crockett house, which is still very much standing, was built on and was the home of Major Andrew Crockett in what's now Brent Haven subdivision. Another house that's still standing on an original land grant, some of which is still owned by the family, would be the Brentwood Country Club, and that too was a Crockett land grant. We associate the Country Club property more with the McGavock family than the Crockett family, but actually way back in the 1800s, a McGavock married a Crockett, and that's the way it got into the McGavock family. Also, another house that's still standing, now the Crockett house that's still standing on an original Crockett grant, is Crockett Springs on Moore's Lane. Also Forge Seat, which is on the corner of Wilson Pike and Crockett Road. That's built on an original Crockett grant.
So in other words, even though Andrew Crockett was a major in the Army, I assume, or whatever.
North Carolina militia.
North Carolina militia.
Excuse me. Go ahead and ask the question, then
then
I'll correct both of us.
Okay. But even though he was part of the military, he did not receive his land grant through those means he bought it.
Right.
I wasn't aware of that.
Right. Major Andrew Crockett could not have received a land grant in Tennessee for his military service. Number one, he was from Virginia, and Virginia did award military grants, but they would have been in Kentucky and not in Tennessee.
This is just an aside, but who awarded the land grants in East Tennessee? Who did those go to?
The East Tennessee came much later. Now, the ones that were in Middle Tennessee, in the Brentwood area, were in the military reservation, and this was pursuant to the Act of 1780 of North Carolina that was specifically designated certain area to be set aside and to be divided up and doled out as land grants as compensation for service. And they chose an area that included most of Williamson County except the extreme southern part, all the way up to what is now the Kentucky line. And this was what was called the North Carolina Military Reservation. East Tennessee was a part of another land granting regime that came later.
Interesting. I'd be curious about that. Okay, talk to me a little bit about just generally not just the land grant families, but the early families in Brentwood, especially the ones who have significant areas or streets named after them.
Well,
The Edmondsons,
okay. One of the very earliest families in Brentwood was the Edmondson family, and of course the Edmondson Pike is named for them. And they actually did not receive a North Carolina land grant, but came awfully close. The land was awarded to a man named Denton, and who did receive a military grant, and he died within 6 months after having received the grant, and it was bought by John Edmondson, and part of that is still in the Edmondson family, as a matter of fact. And the Edmondson grant ran all the way from the county line up Edmondson Pike almost to Concord Road. The traditional southern house, pretty much they all follow the same pattern after a certain period, and you have to sort of realize what the evolution of how the people lived at that time. When they came here from North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, wherever they came from, the first thing that they built was a kitchen. And then the kitchen was always sort of stood alone, and then they would build in front of it another cabin that may have been used as a bedroom or living room, bedroom combination. And then they began to build a second story, and then they would build another cabin adjacent to the one they had just built and right beside it, and which came to be what we know of as the southern mansion with a central hall with 2 rooms up and 2 rooms down, and a wing in the back. The wing in the back was the kitchen wing, and that's 2 plus 2 plus 1, and then they could double that, and you would have 4 up and 4 down, and a wing in the back. And then they all was just plain federal style to begin with, and you start adding a portico and a porch and an upstairs porch and a downstairs porch, and all of a sudden you have a southern mansion.
And what are some of the homes that follow that?
Well, in Brentwood, all of the old homes, you can say with the exception of, say the Ford seat does not follow that pattern. The Frost House does, the Pleasant Hill Mansion, the Knox Crockett House, the newer part of the Knox Crockett House. Because you always go back to, in the back is a log cabin kitchen. In front of it is the mansion. All of the Owens houses, there are 3 of them, all of the 4 Crockett houses, called the Middle Tennessee Federal style.
What about, and I'm backtracking a little bit because I forgot to ask this question. When the early settlers came, obviously this territory was still being used by Native Americans as hunting grounds. So were there conflicts, and can you speak a little bit to that specifically as it pertains to Brentwood?
The going back to the mid-1770s, there was a group of people who got together in North Carolina who decided that they were going to buy up the Indian lands from the Indians, and they did. In fact, a man named Richard Henderson organized a company called the Transylvania Company, and they got together and decided that they were going to call all the Indian chiefs from the Cherokee Nation into a powwow and buy up the Cherokee lands, which included all of what's central Kentucky and Middle Tennessee. And they did, in fact, do that. And they were going to make it the 14th colony and call it Transylvania. That went through, and pursuant to that purchase, Robertson and Donaldson brought their 2 groups of settlers to Fort Nashboro in 1780. But all did not go well with that company. The courts in both Virginia and North Carolina declared that transaction to be a nullity because these people had no right to purchase the property from the Indians.
Did
Number-
they recognize that the Indians owned the property?
Number one. And number two is the Indians did not recognize land ownership as we know it today. Now they did and recognize hunting rights, but not land ownership. And of course it was the hunting rights that was the problem, and that was the reason for all of the Indian raids in the early days of Fort Nashboro. And in going back to the land grant situation, all these 250 families who came here with Robertson and Donaldson thought they owned the property that they had settled on, but it turns out that they did not. And so as a part of this, this act of 1780 in setting aside the military reservation here, the state of North Carolina went ahead and perfected the title to the property that these settlers had settled on. And those grants were called preemption grants. And a lot of the preemption grants were in Brentwood, Tennessee.
What are some examples of some preemption grants?
The Mayfield grant. And what the preemption grant tells you is the people were here in 1780. They had built an improvement on the property, and they were more than 21 years of age. The Mayfields, the Crockett's, all three of the Crockett's got preemption grants. John Henderson got a preemption grant. Lots of.
That's interesting.
The plantation environment in Middle Tennessee, generally, Brentwood specifically, was unlike the plantation environment in much of the South. The South in pre-Civil War days was a land of the haves and the have-nots for the most part. Middle Tennessee, primarily because of the richness of the soil, was able to sustain a farmstead or a plantation on a smaller tract of land than most of the South was able to do at that time. And so there developed, unlike a lot of the rest of the South, a very sturdy middle class of people in Middle Tennessee, in Brentwood and Middle Tennessee. And while slavery was quite widespread, there weren't many people who owned all that many. It was more customary for there to be a single family that owned the farm and maybe a single black family. And there grew out of that situation a higher cultural level among both blacks and whites than you find generally in the South. And that is, which is not to say that there weren't large slave owners in the Brentwood area. There were families that owned maybe 50 or 60, as the Holts and the McGavocks did. But that was a bit unusual. In the days that led up to the Civil War, when the war clouds began to gather over Brentwood, it was the most prosperous day that the South had seen. Everything was going full blast. Some of the finest homes were built in the late 1850s, such as the Pleasant Hill Mansion, which is where we're sitting today, built 1858, just before the war. Ingelheim was built just before the war. It was extremely prosperous. The people, it was a fairyland world, and it was to some degree a house of cards. And the people thought that it could not fall, but it did. And when the war came, Brentwood people were reluctant to join the secession movement, as was all of Tennessee. But when Lincoln sent the call out for troops, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and the people, while they'd been hesitant to go against what their grandfathers had fought to build, they did join the Confederacy and secede from the Union. And from that point on, for the next 4 years, it was a desolation, just chaos. The whole social, religious, educational structure, economic of the Brentwood area came to a standstill until after the war. Then, of course, after the war, the whole thing was swept away. And so it was a new day. They had to start a new life with a new workforce, with a new type of economy, a new type of agriculture. But they survived, as we see. Prior to the Civil War, cotton was king in Brentwood, Tennessee. That was the main crop. There were at least 4 cotton gins inside the city limits of what's now Brentwood. The Holtz had one, the Frost family had one, and the Wilson family had one. There was one on Wilson Pike. Of course, cotton growing is a very labor-intensive kind of agricultural pursuit. And then after the war, there was a shift more to small grains, and particularly to tobacco. And tobacco became the main cash crop of Williamson County. And actually, it was, until recent years, the main cash crop, and it was one of the main reasons that Williamson County was able to regain its wealth and position, economic position. During the Civil War, it is hard to believe how much families were affected, and the Pleasant Hill Plantation comes to mind. There were Colonel John M. Winstead had 12 children, had 9 sons. 5 of those were in the Confederate Army. It's hard to believe how the Civil War, how widespread its effect was on individual families. For instance, the Winstead family that owned the Pleasant Hill Plantation. Colonel Winstead had 12 children, 9 sons, and 5 of those sons enlisted in the Confederate Army very early in the war. And of the 5, 1 came home without a leg, 1 was killed, 1 came home and died a couple of years later from exposure in a federal prison, and on and on. The plantations that had been very viable economic units full of activity, the slaves, for the most part, left the plantations and sought refuge and anonymity in the cities. There's one section of Brentwood that still is black, where they settled. And there was nobody left to run the plantations except the women. And they were very valiant. They did things that they never thought they would have to do, but they survived, and they kept it all together until the war was over and the men folks came home. And the slaves returned to the plantations because they came back too. From day one, the first settlers who came here, for the most part, were somebody when they came. They came from well-established North Carolina and Virginia families who were looking for new opportunities and new fields to plow for both themselves and for their servants. And they had a real sense of quality of life. And I think that throughout the ages, throughout the early settlement days, on through the days leading up to the Civil War, and after the Civil War, one of the foremost things the foremost thing that has made Brentwood what it is searching for and maintaining a quality of life that is a little bit more than just working for a living. And I know that the people I know very well, the people who wrote the first zoning laws for Brentwood, who saw the first development as coming to Brentwood, that their main concern was a preservation of the quality of life in Brentwood, and I think that that is still the chief concern of City Hall today. Brentwood, after the Depression and after the Civil War and Reconstruction, was rediscovered by primarily a group of Nashvillians who were looking for a quality of life too. And they came to Brentwood and bought up the old plantations and the old houses and restored them. And that's, we sometimes can look at that as being the Brentwood Renaissance. And one of the chief players in the Brentwood Renaissance was a man named John Sloan, who moved to Brentwood in the 1930s and bought a very large farm and built a very fine house. And he always said that there were three things that attracted people to Brentwood, and they were houses, horses, and hounds. And he was instrumental in establishing the fox hunt society in Brentwood, and they did in fact fox hunt every Saturday across these hills and fields that we're looking at right now. And this is a part of the quality of life that, and it's more than economics, and it's more than education, but it's sort of a combination of all of them. The quality of life in Brentwood is actually, it's more than a economics, and it's more than education. It really is a combination of various things that work together to, I don't have the words. Let me think about that. But you know, the people in Brentwood went beyond Brentwood. I never went to school a day in my life in this county. And you know, they were people who were worldly, really, more than you probably would think.
They're not simple country folk.
Right, that's right. They were. The first settlers who came to Brentwood came from well-established families in Virginia and North Carolina. And they really were somebody when they came here. And they were accustomed to a fairly good quality of life. And they continued that here. And I don't think that we have ever really lost a sense of trying to maintain a fine quality of life through economic prosperity and through education and travel and enlightenment and appreciation for the intangible things of life. But I think that there is one thing for sure, that affluence is nothing new to Brentwood. Settlers who came to the Brentwood area came from well-established families in North Carolina, in Virginia, and South Carolina. They were people who were somebody when they came here. They came from large families and whose slave population had increased, and they were looking for new fields to plow, and they found them here in the Brentwood area of Williamson County. And they were accustomed to a fairly sophisticated quality of life, which they continued on. And I think one of the main ways that we see these people and their thoughts about quality of life is in the houses that they built. And many of these houses are still standing today. Then after the Civil War, they came back and reestablished themselves and their plantations. I did my thesis in law school on the Brentwood zoning law in 1965, which was new at that time. It was the highest zoning ordinance in the nation, just about, the requirements. And it was my thesis in my thesis that what the people of Brentwood were trying to achieve through the zoning ordinance was a return to agrarianism, like the agrarians of Vanderbilt, the fugitive movement, and got me an A on that.
So what is it you think, what is it?
It's the return to agrarianism. It's an appreciation for the land, and it's that's what sustains life, and I think we see that reflected in the zoning ordinance today. We see it in the 1 acre density requirement. It's an appreciation for the land. It's an appreciation for the agrarian way of life which we and our ancestors were familiar with and appreciated and lived on and prospered on.
And even as far back as the Native Americans, it's a respect for
Indeed.
the environment.
And one thing that we do need to note is that all of the really good land grants in Brentwood were sites of old Indian towns, and we were all looking for the same thing.